Perfect, thank you. As I say, delighted to be with you this morning, and I'm going to spend about the next 20 minutes just talking about some of the work that I'm doing as the National Police Chiefs Council lead for the response to stalking and harassment offences on behalf of the police service. In the 20 minutes I've got, I'm going to start with actually the scale of the challenge which met me in 2019 when I first started in this role. It is an ancillary role. My work, as Clive has said, is to work alongside the 43 Chief Constables in England and Wales to try and improve the policing approach to stalking and harassment. So I'll set out some of the work that we have been doing. I'm then also going to spend a little bit of time on just why that is so important in terms of the journey that I've been on as a police professional over this last sort of 4-year period. Almost just looking at actually the impact of this type of criminality, which Clive has touched on in his introduction. And then finally, I'm going to finish just giving a brief overview of some of the work which I think we need to focus on actually going forward. So lots to pack in the 20 minutes that I have to speak to you. But I'm going to start with what was in my intro when I came into post back in 2019. At that point in time, there was a really damning report which had just been written by Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and also the Inspectorate on behalf of the Crown Prosecution Service. And this really laid bare sort of Clive's opening point there I was drawn to around the system and the system having to respond in the right way. And at that point in time, what that identified was, firstly, there was a poor understanding of stalking and harassment, and Clive's touched on some of the definition issues there that we have. There was significant under-recording of stalking, and this wasn't helping in terms of the identification of risk. Very low prosecution rates for stalking, and I'll come on to talk about that shortly in terms of some of the work that we still have to do in that space. And those sort of two next bullet points around initial risk assessment and risk management was often lacking in cases such that officers and staff who were responding were not actually identifying what was actually in front of them in terms of the risks which actually presented. At that point in time, we also had something called police information notices, which was, I guess, almost like a warning system. And what was happening was it was being used almost as the default position for any report of stalking cases. And what that meant was that officers often were not actually dealing with, again, what was that risk which was directly in front of them. So that report made 22 recommendations, which predominantly were at the Home Office, the police service level, College of Policing, and also for the Crown Prosecution Service. So there's been a lot to do in this space to actually improve our response. And when I came in, I think what I was clear on was this needed a whole system approach. Absolutely, the police are front and centre around victims coming forward, but they're not the only part of the story. So I'm not going to go into all of the detail on this slide, but the success of some of the work that we've done, and we have absolutely very much more to do, has been around a whole systems approach to this. So what I chair is a National Stalking and Harassment Offences Working Group, which is really looking at trying to improve the response of policing, but policing alongside other partners. So we work with the Home Office, the Crown Prosecution Service, the College of Policing, and critically the Stalking Consortium. We have a number of speakers today who are represented as part of the Stalking Consortium with different charities, and looking to understand the victim's journey and why it's so important that we get this right. And again, later on today, we'll hear from prisons and probation around that sort of end of the criminal justice system element. In terms of this slide, but some of the things that we've tried to do is what I have in terms of that working group from a policing perspective is I have sort of around 10 police leads who are across the geographic map of England and Wales, who work with me for the national working group to cascade some of the work that we're trying to do. Equally, in each of the forces, we have a SPOC network, so single point of contact across the 43 forces, whereby there is someone in that force who has that responsibility for trying to translate what I'm doing at a national level into local practice. And you can see also on the slide there, the Crown Prosecution Service and Probation and Prisons have also done similar. Some of the work that we've focused on in this sort of last period has been firstly working with the Crown Prosecution Service in 2018. There was a joint protocol which was published, which was really around actually what does good look like from that point of first call all the way through the criminal justice system. How can we assist officers and staff within policing, but make sure there's a handover in terms of the Crown Prosecution Service's responsibility to make sure that victims try where we're able to get that seamless service. As I said, we've introduced the Spot network, but we've also heavily focused on crime recording and trying to improve the crime recording around stalking cases, which was identified in that inspectorate report. Because there isn't a definition per se for stalking in the legislation, as Clive touched on in his introduction, we've used 4 around fixation, obsession, unwanted and repeated behaviour, and really tried to use this in terms of its simplicity to guide officers and staff in terms of their decision making around trying to understand the difference between harassment and stalking offences, because we know within that 4 that is where the real risk actually sits. To assist with that, we've worked heavily with the College of Policing. We've implemented a suite of training and guidance material for leaders, investigators and critically police responders, and we've also had the agreement to remove the police information notices, which, as I touched on in my earlier slide, were really impacting upon the decision making of officers dealing with what was actually in front of them and what was actually presented by victims. So that gives an overview of some of the journey that we've been on, and absolutely there is more to do in this space, and we have seen, and there's been a secondary inspection report in 2019, that there has been some progress here, but absolutely more to do in my inbox. But I'm just going to now move on to sort of understanding the scale of the problem and build on some of Clive's opening remarks. So harassment, as you can see, I'm not going to again go into all the data on here, is one of those crimes which has increased, but I would say has stabled over the course of the last sort of 4 years. So we see last 2021 figures around 220 reported, and that's a critical word, reported offences in England and Wales. Stalking is where we've seen the big increase in terms of some of the work that we've been doing around actually stalking being far better recorded by the police service at the point of contact. And you can see from 2017-18, there are around 10,000 reported crimes, again, really important word, and we're now up around that 100 sort of K mark, and actually just gone over that in terms of the latest statistics. The problem with some of this in terms of making comparisons is, as you can see along that sort of journey, there have been changes to how the police service, working with the Home Office, actually counts and records crime. So trying to do comparisons, this is probably the first year that we're able to actually do some comparisons with that. But it's only half of the story, and Clive has touched on this in his introduction. And again, I'm just going to sort of play back a couple of those statistics. So we can see statistics there: 1 in 10 adult men, 1 in 5 adult women will experience stalking behaviour during their life. Clearly, that's not all reported to the police. Some really concerning stuff, and it comes back to that system response bit, which Clive touched on. Research will tell us on average victims experience about 100 incidents of stalking before they first report it. So that build up in terms of that risk, but also that expectation and right expectation of victims when they have the courage then to come forward to the police. It is critical that we are absolutely committed to getting that response right. Again, Clive's touched on the figure there in terms of the incidence of homicide, and where you see in this research was undertaken, particularly around femicide. There was this footprint of previous stalking and perpetrator behaviour, which was in those cases when they were reviewed. And again, just repeating what some of the points were that Clive made in his introduction, what I've really, I guess, reflected on in my time in post is just the impact upon victims of these sorts of cases. And you can see from some of the research here that victims tend to blame themselves. But in terms of that human impact, suicide, anxiety, depression, loss of confidence, as the impact of the perpetrator behaviour builds. And that often leads to isolation. People will try and avoid their stalker. They'll move job, they'll change address, and they'll even become cut off from their family and friends. So this is really impactive criminality that we're talking about. And just in terms of some of the themes which are coming out, we'll hear more about this today, but without stealing Saskia's thunder, certainly through the lockdown period and probably before that, and it continues sort of after now as we try and get ourselves out of COVID, a real rise in the incidence of cyber abuse and cyber stalking. And again, I'm not going to go into all of these statistics, you can see them, but this comes both from ONS data, but also from our key partners in terms of the charities, where you can see across the board, what we're seeing is actually where cyber stalking probably wouldn't have perhaps been so prevalent 5-10 years ago, if I was talking to you, it really has a footprint now. And just going to the Paladin piece of information there, what we're seeing is individuals that probably in the past wouldn't have used digital methods to access information about their victims and stalk them, because it's now more readily available through the advances in technology, we're seeing that is far more prevalent, and again it's creating far more risk.